And to the angel of the Church of Smyrna write, the first and the last, who was dead and has come to life, says this, in Revelations 2:9-11. I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the blasphemy by those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to cast some of you into prison, so that you will be tested, and you will have tribulation for 10 days. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt by the second death. These letters are very structured, and the structure repeats from letter to letter, which helps us interpret them. Starting with the meaning of the city's name, Smyrna. The name is a transliteration of the Greek word Smyrna, which is the word for myrrh. Myrrh was most commonly associated with death and burial, since it was a primary embalming spice used to prepare dead bodies. Today, Smyrna is called Izmir and is still a thriving city in Turkey. But in Jesus' day, it was just another Roman city, full of pagan temples, most notably a temple to the Emperor Tiberius. That made this town the heart of emperor worship in Asia Minor, and as such, it became an early persecutor of Christians. Roman law at the time prohibited any religion except emperor worship. Judaism was the only religion granted an exception due to the stubbornness of Jews to conform. For a time in the first century, Romans viewed Christians as an offshoot of Judaism, so the church enjoyed the same protections. But before the end of the century, the church had become predominantly Gentile. As a result, the Romans came to see the church as distinct from Judaism and a threat to the empire. Furthermore, the Jews rejected and persecuted Christians, thereby becoming allies with the Romans against the church. Smyrna seems to have been on the forefront of this transition from tolerating Christianity to persecuting believers. Remember, Jesus addresses each church with a detail taken from John's description of Jesus in chapter 1. The detail Jesus selects reflects what he intends to say to that church. In this case, the connection is obvious. A church destined for persecution should remember that death is not the end of us. Jesus died too, so he knows what it's like to face the death of a body. Then he rose again, proving he has the power to bring life back from death. He has promised that those who believe in him will experience the same transformation. Just as Jesus faced death obediently, so should Christians, knowing death will not be the end of us. From there, Jesus moves to acknowledging that this church is suffering tribulation and poverty. The tribulation was likely a result of Jewish opposition to Christianity, though later the Romans joined in, and their poverty was closely connected to the persecution. Most manual labor trades in Roman society were tightly controlled by powerful trade unions. Membership in the unions was required to work in your trade. These unions worshipped pagan gods, and participation in ritual worship and sacrifice was required as part of union membership. A Christian who refused to worship the trade union's God would be set out of the union and unable to work, leading to poverty. Jesus blames the church's troubles on Jews who were not really Jews but were instruments of the devil, a synagogue of Satan. Jesus' words give you a clear indication of how Jesus views those of Jewish background who do not recognize him as Messiah. They were Jewish, but Jesus says they are Jewish in name only. There are only two kinds of people in the world from God's point of view. We are either believers in Jesus or we are his enemies. Jesus says he knows the true heart of those persecuting the church, and yet he doesn't say he will stop the persecution. Likewise, Jesus says he knows they have poverty, but he doesn't say he will remove it from them. Instead, he says they are actually rich. How is that true? Jesus is saying that their suffering and their tribulation is earning for them Christ's approval, and that approval will result in treasure in heaven. They may be poor on earth, but because they endure that trial well and turn it into a witness, they will be rewarded by Christ. But that reward will not be on earth, because the rewards we await from Jesus are not given to us until we are resurrected. And that's far preferable, since heavenly rewards do not wear out and cannot be taken from us, unlike earthly benefits. Jesus tells the church how to make the most of these circumstances. He says not to fear the situation, even as they face death for their faith. Fearing death is an impediment to pleasing Jesus, because it gets in the way of obedience and eternal reward. Fear of death causes us to make bad choices, selfish choices that are the opposite of faith. And that fear is ultimately pointless, since we know that death isn't a bad thing for a Christian. Paul says to die is gain for us. This church couldn't let fear drive their response to their circumstances, but instead they should enter into their suffering with confidence. They are enduring tribulation and poverty, but the Lord isn't going to remove those things. Instead, he tells the church how to endure them with their witness intact. Jesus' goal for the church wasn't in preserving their earthly comfort or lengthening their earthly life. His goal was encouraging their earthly witness for his glory. And through that obedience, they maximize their eternal reward. He warns them that prison awaits, and after a short time, where their faith would be tested, then would come death. Roman prisons were not places of permanent confinement. Romans had no incentive to house prisoners for long periods of time. After all, why give free food and clothing to criminals? Romans would conduct swift trials, usually, and the punishment would follow quickly. A less serious penalty might include a fine for scourging or other torture. A more serious crime would mean death. Therefore, the deadline of 10 days is consistent with the time for Roman justice system to bring a verdict and carry out a sentence. It may have been the time required to be transported into a Roman amphitheater where they would be fed to the lions. But the number 10 in the Bible is also symbolic of testimony. So Jesus is hinting at an opportunity for testimony. In other words, the coming persecution would lead to the death of believers in Smyrna. And Jesus wasn't going to change that. It was his will that the church in Smyrna be martyred for his name's sake. If they made the most of the opportunity to be a witness in death, they stood to gain great things in heaven. Being faithful in this context refers to the believer's behavior in the face of persecution. Specifically, Jesus says if they remain faithful through that short trial, they would receive the crown of life. The crown of life is given to those who endure persecution faithfully, as we see here. James confirms this interpretation in James 1:12. Blessed is a man who perseveres under trial, for once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Finally, the letter ends with a promise that those who overcome will not be hurt by the second death. What about the prophetic value of this letter? We already know that Smyrna is a church of persecution or death, and that reflects the history of the church. Following the first century, the church entered a period of persecution under Roman opposition lasting more than 200 years. This period began with the Emperor Domitian in AD 96 and continued until the early 4th century. There were 10 emperors during that time who undertook persecution against the church. Prophetically, it seems the 10 days of waiting mentioned in the letter also alludes to the 10 emperors who attacked the church.